We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Take your own advice.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No delusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Harry, find your hair to be president.
Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothgujot.
All right. It is Sunday, February 18th. And we're going to, I think we're going to talk here for about 50 minutes to an hour and give a few thoughts on some things that have been happening as of late as it relates to what we call Tucker Carlson's Aldi radicalization in air quotes, and some of the dynamics related to that, and the Vladimir Putin interview, and things that are going on in terms of even our own domestic political situation as it relates to certain, as it relates to border security bills and foreign aid bills, and some trends that we've seen going on with that. And I know we also want to talk a little bit about I know you, Jeremy, before we finish, want to talk a little bit about a topic that we're going to be going deeper into as it relates to some things that you're seeing and putting together as far as the situation with Palestine goes, and various what could or could not be considered leadership elements within the Palestinian community as it relates to 10/7 and even longer term before that, and in terms of current events, things that are going to be happening. So we're just going to, as I said here, spend about 50 minutes to an hour to discuss these aforementioned topics. And so, Jeremy, how you doing today?
I'm okay. It is quite a moment. I'll admit that I feel a bit overwhelmed in terms of the nature of the moment, the hyper normalization, and but I'm working to get that stuff off my back.
Yeah, and that was I think that was part of we both just took a bit of a hiatus away from things after October 7th, and I feel like that because like that was just, there was a lot happening there, obviously, and it was, but I feel like that, and I think you feel the same way too, is that we can get very overwhelmed at times, and for us, we are dealing with, like, we keep talking about it, we are dealing with going into like 2024, and we are just continuing to enter into just things that we haven't seen play out before, and just the unpredictability of like a political season that we've never seen before, in terms of just the way things are happening now, and just the continued I think the warfare around narratives, it continues to just get more and more pronounced and more and as time goes on. But I do feel like that break, and now just to come in, I feel like we are both, we had a chance to, I think, just like clear our minds a little bit. I think it has, and there are those times where we get those feelings coming away because, as we just said, like, it is uncertain, and things that we haven't seen before, like, play out in our modern political history as Americans, and things that just affect all of these matters that we talk about, domestic issues, geopolitical issues, and it can get heady and overwhelming at times. But I feel like we, at least at the moment now, I think we're a bit of a healthier place than we were in, and I feel at the moment confident and pretty good about our ability, I think, to work to some of our strengths as far as analyzing things that we've been analyzing for several years that continue to affect us, and also I think the evolution of these varying areas where I think we've had a pretty strong take on, and pretty strong good mindset on, as far as these trends and analyzing certain things, and continuing to do that in this moment. I feel pretty good about that right now. So
I keep coming back to books, especially with the combination of how we work to combine multimedia and all source analysis, and then and just in the last week, the announcing of OpenAI's text to video creation, it begins to really feel like a moment where reality, the media reality, is totally up for grabs in some way, and really that it's become a shapeable blob of some sort. And so, more and more, when those kinds of things happen, I not only want to go into them and see the potential implications, but more and more, I also see that some of the roots of the public interest intellectual tradition, which are in the realm of discourse, of open discourse, especially spoken word, combined with writing, and then also basic things such as what is the nature of public speech in real life, and as video becomes more and more very nebulous in terms of its background and whether you can trust it. It seems that we are going to need to head back to very old senses of how we analyze and deploy the truth, such as, for example, there for maybe about 20, something like 20 to 30 years, something like that. I think there was a rise of audio video evidence in terms of our justice system in courts, both in civil and criminal court. And it became the fact that things like video evidence would often be seen as testimony of a virtually unassailable sort in many ways. And I think that now what's going to happen is we're heading back towards this idea of testify, right? And that if there are these ideas that, testify comes back to a man, putting his hand over his testes and being like, I, promise not only in under God that this is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, but to the willingness to put it on the family jewels, really. And it's always been the case that even in the rise of audio visual media as evidence in courtrooms, it's always still has to have provenance shown, and that has to be testified to by human beings. And so I think what we're going to see is a renaissance of testimony in many ways, and that it's things like what might have been considered anecdotal evidence before is going to become more and more and more and more important. And then additionally, things like human beings gathering together, what I call assembled intelligence, the real AI, which is the real purpose of the First Amendment protection of freedom of assembly, is it actually is an incorporation of the public deployment of these other rights that includes the individual's right to speech and press and freedom of conscience and religion, then put together in this very old framework of human beings are best. We're not only a competitive species, but we're also a cooperative species. And public assembly is really the synthesis of the best of both our cooperative and competitive functions, where you have debate, which is competitive. It's like a courtroom. There's a sense of that there's an aggressive deployment to find the truth, but then also this idea that we come together and we compare notes and we compare logics, we compare rhetorical approaches to all of this. So, and more and more, like as I begin to feel overwhelmed by even just the technological moment emerging and all of the political implications of that, there's aspects of the analog that I don't romanticize them. Books were always a major source of quote unquote disinformation, right? In many ways, and human beings have been lying and deceiving each other since we could speak. But there are certain real long-term, durable, and I would say even maybe anti-fragile considerations in terms of these very long-term approaches to human deliberation. And just one thing that popped in my mind is like how 2024 really begins to seem in my mind like 2016 times 100. And you can imagine if like the social media had been totally mapped out in terms of network analysis to a very large reach. And then you have these actual kinetic wars going on in terms of these two major players back in 2016. Netanyahu's Israel and Putin's Russia. Now they are on the ground and it's ongoing. And meanwhile, we're already beginning to see a heightened rollout of all of the other elements of hybrid warfare in terms of information warfare. The most obvious example is what you started with in terms of Tucker Carlson going to interview Putin and discovering that the Russians had invented shopping cart technology where you deposit 10 rubles into a shopping cart, and that's how you dissuade your homeless people from taking it back to their encampments. And I mean, meanwhile, a lot of Americans have been to things like Aldi's grocery stores. There's one here that our family has gone to for many years. It's about 2 miles away. You deposit a quarter there, and this, so this is I think an interesting moment because it feels like very old forms of very crude propaganda that Tucker Carlson is engaged in here, even just in terms of like the Russian sphere, combined with the heightened effects of the fire hose of deception, the fire hose of lies, or if you're putting it in the Bannon and Roger Stone spun American context, the fire hose of crap that is now 1,000x what it was in days past.
So many things you said there, I agree with, and it will allow me to. I'm glad you brought up some of these things because it helps me with like the points that I want to make here coming up. But with the first of all, with the whole Tucker Aldi thing, I mean that like this really just it made him look really bad. I just no other way to put it because he is presenting himself as like the voice of the, of the everyman, of the American worker who feels betrayed and turns to Donald Trump or turns to certain voices. And Tucker Carlson kind of serves as like a whisperer to some extent, or like the person who airs out, the grievances of the. Meanwhile, he's completely unfamiliar with technology that's at Aldi stores that I guarantee the vast majority of people who would classify themselves as middle class, working class people who have voted for or supported Donald Trump is familiar with. So, I mean, it was just, I think that was just an all around terrible moment for him. I think it really was kind of a mask off moment where he's really just maybe even because he's so out of touch with like the concerns of what you might call everyday Americans, or what some people might dismissively call flyover country or whatever, or middle class, working class America, that he just has such a maybe even not even intentional on his part, just mask off moment of revealing that he's just not like anything but this voice of the everyday American that he tries to portray himself as, both on his Fox show and now like in his post Fox era on X. And it's interesting, he's doing that while trying to make the point between his trip to the Russian Aldi, to his visit to the Russian McDonald's, all the way to his visit at a clean Moscow subway station. Of basically, he's using his platform to push that our society sucks and this way of living is better. And then it becomes the reason for that is, well, pick any number of reasons, culture war reasons why our society is crumbling and falling apart. And this is why basically America is a bad place to be, and Russia is a good place to be. And he serves that meanwhile also basically being browbeaten and disrespected by Putin throughout this 2-hour interview he did with him, which was really interesting for a lot of reasons. Just everything from Putin basically going through making a 1400-year historical argument as to why the Russian version of there's no such thing as a Palestinian with relation to no, Ukraine doesn't exist. Ukrainians don't exist. This is our land and it belongs to us, which flies in the face of so much of like what a lot of people have been trying to push, this simply the idea that, this is just Russia responding to all of this aggressive NATO Western coming to their doorstep and breaking promises and treaties and all this. And there was some of that in the Putin Tucker interview, but it was like Putin really laying out like this 30 to 45 minute historical lesson that I don't think Tucker was prepared to hear, that he really necessarily appreciated hearing, of basically blowing your narratives out the window. And this is why this land belongs to us. And this is why we are historically entitled to have it. And we're going to get it, all while also still presenting the narrative of our backs are against the wall and we have to do this and all of this. So it was very interesting how that aspect of the Putin Tucker thing played out. But Tucker just goes on this full-on just propaganda trip to Russia, and I think it was pointed out by a podcast I was listening to that this would have been unheard of when Mitt Romney was running for president. Just like this level of like we admire the historic enemy of America and God and capitalism, all of this, the Russians, we admire them to this level that we've got American media personalities. Maybe, Tucker, who I think at Fox was the most influential American MSM figure. And I think he still is, like with his Twitter platform. I think he's even got more of a reach than he had at Fox now. And he's in the face of American populism, is openly, publicly flaunting that Russia is a better place to be than America. We need to be like Russia. And if only we could clean up our own mess, we could have a better society like Russia has and a clean society like Russia has. And we need all this clean food at their version of McDonald's. And we could have this wonderful technology that he doesn't realize actually exists in American grocery stores that working class people.
This is incredible.
Can have it every single day.
Greg, this is just amazing. The Russians have this technology called the car boot that dissuades their tax and ticket evaders from being able to drive off in their cars when they don't have when they haven't paid their tickets. It's incredible. I mean, it is pretty wild. Like there's aspect, even the Moscow subway station. That was, it appears that the history is that it was created in a way for propaganda during the Soviet era, actually. And it was presented as, the Soviet Union economy is working. And it's as dishonest journalistically to do things like that, like to basically just go to the centers of power in a country, and then proclaim that to be representative of the entire country's approach and how things are going for the economics of the average person, as like, going to the museums of Washington, D.C., and then sort of just being like, oh, wow, West Virginians like who live in polluted coal country and who have cancers and have their little towns totally destroyed and upended by long-term deindustrialization and corporate capture of the American government don't even exist in many ways. So it's outrageous. And then to say that that's what's now radicalized you.
Yeah, it's like the type of people who I think would be correctly vilified for giving like a sanitized version of America based on a carefully constructed photo op of Rockefeller Center at Christmas time, and that's I think you get what I'm getting at. Like in terms of these carefully constructed photo ops of look how great our and just leaving out so many other things that are the case. And then, this is like that. And just going back to my point, like this just how far things have changed to where like you now can have people. I mean, Tucker still does the plausible deniability of, well, I'm not a Putin file. I think he does the lady doth protest a bit too much shtick that Alex Jones does when he defends himself against like the ideas of, I'm not a Russophile, but Putin's not gonna cut my children's genitals off, blah, blah, blah. It's some of that, but it's even with that plausible deniability of, well, I'm not actually a Russophile. I'm doing this for the best interest of my country, and they just happen to have a model that we like. It's still very much this something that was unheard of a few years ago of a media personality as influential as a Tucker Carlson with the reach that he has and the background he has, quite frankly, openly going and basically doing a PR trip to Moscow and telling Americans why this is so much better of a place to live than our, to quote Donald Trump, shitholes, cities that have been destroyed by the combination of wokeness and whatever terms you want to use for it. And it's just, I mean, it's pretty amazing that we've come to this. And that's just one example of like, and I want to get into this circle back to this before we finish up of just how even far things have come from 2016. This is one example of that. And now you said it's 2016 on steroids, or maybe it's 2016 on fentanyl. I don't know if that's the term, but I mean, there's so much that has changed. There's so much more at stake now. And we saw the first, what you might call spiritual compromising of the, this is the point I wanted to make you start talking about like AI and stuff, is the first spiritual compromising of like this would be the religious conservatives, the evangelicals, was bringing in Trump and selling him and sanitizing this very disgusting human being with a long track record of all sorts of criminality and depravity as a guy who is really what God wants to, God has chosen to elect to lead our country in all of this. And now 8 years later, you brought up like this AI and brought up the state of like some of these, is that now you've got this other takeover, I think, in terms of Elon Musk and the gang surrounding him, maybe, the whole David Sachs, going back to the eBay, PayPal mafia type of conglomerates that were in place, of this takeover of the most influential social media outlet in the world, to where now not only is it Donald Trump is good, but then also now these things that people like, the Alex Jones of the world would be so bombastically sounding the alarm about, of like the types of things that Elon Musk seems to be involved in and is involved in now, ultimately is acceptable and is also going to be part of the apparatus that's going to save us, because he happens to own the most powerful media outlet in the world, and has brought back all the people who were banned before that, and has even made Twitter/X like as much as it was a problem several years ago, like it is just so much more pronounced and out of control now, as you said, just like the narrative warfare just being thrown at you from all directions. And I think this is another level of like I don't know if it would be spiritual compromise exactly, but it's definitely some type of compromising of pushing these personalities and these people and these ideas as like that would have been at one point what you would have warned about, now being the entities that are going to really, that we have to turn to in order to save us from this, from however you describe the bigger enemy as being ultimately. I mean, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and it's interesting the moment with the Tucker Putin interview, and you mentioned that Putin went off on this 30-minute exploration of a millennia and a half of Rus history, the deep Rus history, and while having already sort of like insulted or negged Tucker, did you want this to be a some kind of a talk show, or is this a real conversation? And Tucker said, "That's let's have a real conversation."
That was I just real quick bring that up. Like that was, I saw that maybe as like a bit of like a muscle flexing on Putin's part, kind of like this is almost like a symbolism of like, I can treat your I can treat I can treat I can treat your people who work as propagandists for us, whether they know it or not, any way I want to, and they are powerless and don't do anything about it. Kind of. There was a bit of that, because I mean, he really was not respectful of Tucker during this interview, and so yeah, and I think that might have also been a play.
Yeah, and even Putin saying, "All right, well then give me 30 seconds to a minute," and and then goes on 30 minutes to an hour in terms of that, and that was all as a result of an interesting first question, actually, which was, why or when did you decide to invade Ukraine? And
Right.
that's an interesting question. That should have been more deeply explored. And Tucker never really gets there. So it basically, well, it was inevitable when the in the 700, it's sort of like, tell me why you think Netanyahu is bombing the crap out of Gaza. Let me tell you about the Tartars and I mean, it's a very wild kind of revelation. It should be a revelation, actually, for a lot of the Russian disinformation sphere, I'll call them, the narrative warfare sphere, that have really taken the opportunity to rise up again in relationship to, I would call, a very weaponized false solidarity with the Palestinian people at this moment, to push their talking points, because the whole thing was that they said that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia was all about, that Putin could have given a very specific moment. Was it this sort of the falling apart of Minsk One? Was it Minsk Two? Was it the Maidan massacre? What was the moment when you sort of knew that it was inevitable that you would have to do your special military operation against the Euchre Nazi global homo disco regime? And and so that never gets answered. And then meanwhile, there was not even a single question about the Middle East. There was not a they didn't talk about it at all. And there would have been some very interesting areas to go there, right? In terms of, what did you think about Hamas giving you this present, giving Netanyahu his present on your birthday? What
And
people, certain Jewish American dissidents like Jeffrey Blankford have followed up on the mainstream media, American media, is calling of your long-term relationship with Netanyahu a bromance. What is the nature of your relationship now? And so there's nothing there. And so what is interesting is that it should have exposed that all of this fronting about that this was all about NATO encroachment and the Maidan coup and all of that was not really the case. That there's a much deeper Eurasianist, a Duganist, the Russian mix of the Russian Empire in a sort of a Soviet sphere in the way that Putin sees it, that was really behind all of this, and not so much national security politics or human rights politics in terms of your ethnic and Russian speaking citizens in East Ukraine being attacked by the Ukrainian Nazis, or a denazification. And even Tucker gets into the whole denazification with Putin. Basically, he sounds like he's fighting the woke in the West when Tucker's asked. It's almost like that standard trope that people use in terms of the war on terror. How can you fight an emotion or something like that? Or like, how can you kill Hamas? How can you wipe out Hamas when it's an political ideology or something like that? That's the way that Tucker. That was the only place where he seemed to push Putin a little bit, was Putin saying that the ultimate result that he would know was a winning of his invasion of Ukraine, was when it was totally denazification. And Tucker's like, well, you can't do that. How are you going to do that? What, are you going to start polling everyone about what they believe and that kind of thing? And so it really does. It did. The interview was, very interestingly, a lot less on crude culture war. That's where I expected that it might go, if it was to be used mainly as like a neo-MAGA kind of bludgeon of some sort, but it really seemed to be more of a Putin aggressive diplomatic kind of push of some sort at home and abroad for himself, and so this is what we said early on in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that this had to do with Novorossiya. Right, that was even mentioned by Putin. I think we talked about Greater Russia, that this concept that Dugin was pushing, that we think sounds very much like Greater Israel, that is being deployed right now. So the fact that both of those are happening at the exact same time, the Greater Russia project via kinetic warfare, and then the filling out of aspects of the Greater Israel project, being where there's over 10,000 children already killed. It's not even a war, obviously. Like, it is a war. Russia is actually, it's a preemptive war. Think about that. That's very much, I think, what we see in terms of what began to crystallize in the post 9/11 era, was this really long-term, very Israeli stratagem that goes back, I think, to the very origins of the country and people like Ben Gurion, where it was this idea of preemptive war. Let's figure out how that we're going to have to fight the Arabs. We're going to have to fight the Egyptians at some point if we want our Greater Israel solidified. And so let's figure out how to preempt the war. And so that's what we see in terms of Putin in Russia. Now, Netanyahu, this is not a war. This is a bombing of a fenced-off, concentration camp of some sort, which is in a very nice location, I guess, in terms of being on the Mediterranean. But to see these two happening at the same time, this assertion of Greater Russia as the core of the legitimization of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then this Greater Israel push by Netanyahu in killing tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza and really trying to do a national genocide against them. Under that one's under cloak, that Netanyahu is not publicly articulating Greater Israel in the way that Putin really is articulating Greater Russia. But that is what's going on beneath the surface in terms of Netanyahu and in the Israeli regime's intent, even though it's under cloak, again, of a war on terror. I'd say that this actually is the apex. It's almost maybe the strange attractor at the end of the age of the war on terror is the Israeli attempted genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza.
You make a great point of both of these things happening. Remember, another thing we also talked about, a lot of people talked about, was that you remember, contrary to what Trump and the whole MAGA propaganda circles would like you to believe, that this wouldn't have happened if I were president. No, this is something that we had talked about. How this is something that happened as a result of it, and then also the once you see both Israel and Russia move into like this, at least the interest around Netanyahu and around Putin, respectively, move into this mode that in the following administration, post-Trump, after I think the first Trump administration, it greased the skids to help make certain things possible that would allow for these types of escalations to take place. And we talked about that. And I think that is the case with both of these, and that might be another matter from the time. But I do think there is that dynamic at play with both of these. And Jeremy, relating to Russia and Novorossiya, as you talked about, you had a debate with Kevin Barrett on his radio show where you mentioned a lot of this stuff, and it just became apparent at that moment that these people don't actually care about they are actually they're actually okay with it, because they're not, they're okay with it if it's, or for it if it's seen as for the right purposes or whatever. Like, if this is how Russia is going to respond to the degenerate global democracy and all of this, and the immorality of global democracy, or however, whatever terms we want to put around it, of the liberal world order or whatnot, then it's kind of a means ends justify the means kind of thing. And I think we didn't realize that as much as we do now before that. Would you say that's correct?
Yes, and yeah, people might want to go listen to that debate that I had with Kevin Barrett, because he does. It's when I finally understood that Kevin was actually an imperialist, that he actually believed in empire as long as it was the New Horizons type of Eurasian empire, and he's also sort of anti-democracy to some extent. And then it's very interesting that it's then followed up. My debate with Kevin is then followed up by his very friendly interview with James Fetzer, where he prompts Fetzer to attack me as some kind of nut because of how critical I am of Trump and Putin and and all of this. So
But they're they represent the real liberalism before it was taken over by all this out of control wokeness and degeneracy and all that. That's what James Fetzer represents, right?
yeah, and it's interesting. I think that a lot of people who didn't come through the kind of political circles that we did, and you from the more libertarian right, and me from the more progressive left in certain ways, right? But then into things like truth movement and all of that. I think a lot of folks who don't have that kind of background and who have worked further to evolve their understanding, I think like we have, don't understand how pervasive some of this kind of narrative warfare, specifically surrounding like these very Eurasianist thinkers like Dugin actually are. And people still don't understand. They still believe that like meme social media culture is somehow organic, even though you can realize like the minute that Navalny was announced dead, there you saw the about 5 to 10 talking points that were clearly just ready to go, generated, and that if people saw it in the same kind of context of Epstein dying in his cell or something like that, and then saw a bunch of talking points that represented a quote unquote establishment line in an American context, they would immediately know, okay, this is some kind of narrative warfare. This is being a fire hose of, remember, that's the nature of the fire hose of lies, or the fire hose of deception, or the fire hose of propaganda or disinformation, or throwing a bunch of crap into the public mind, as Bannon and Roger Stone might propose. That the technique is to come early, right? It's the idea of like, a lie has made its way how many times around the world before the truth gets its pants on. And then it's also repetition, right? So it's basically multiply the mimetic angles, keep them nice and tight but diverse. So there's everyone can grab on to one that they really feel that speaks to them, and then repeat, 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 repeat. And so I think people don't really understand. A lot of people don't really understand, like, who have been so close to some of these scenes, and the 9/11 truth movement, or the Ron Paul libertarian movement, or conspiracy culture more generally, or alt media, that how pervasively massaged and shaped, and really in many ways controlled by state-sponsored propaganda and narrative warfare, and very, very Russian, as you begin to look back on it. And I've talked about before, like especially like Kevin Barrett. He's the one who then was proposing me to then be brought into the New Horizons pipeline, which we have identified as a Dugin pipeline. That it's a New Horizons where Dugin is sitting there with all of these so-called American dissidents, and announcing that 9/11 was the moment where there was going to be a rise of the multipolar world order. And by the way, one of the other major things that happened in the Tucker interview that would play to this entire network of propagandists is Tucker just said it's non-controversial now that we live in the multipolar world order. Right. And so that's just an announcement. There's no debate about it, are we moving from a unipolar to a multipolar? No, we are in the multipolar world order. And all we really need now is to dig up a speech from Putin before he became prime minister and or president of Russia, where he talked about a new world order. And it was on the anniversary of 9/11 or October 7th. And as we pointed out before, October 7th is not only Putin's birthday, but it looks like it's the date where George W. Bush announces the kinetic launch of the 21st century global war on terror, where he announces the first move into Afghanistan, which, by the way, was on the table before September 11th. And so we once again, I think we come back to that one of the most potent sources of sort of washing away a lot of this fire hose of crap continues to be fixed points of deep political truths around deep events, especially now that we've identified that this is now the world of the twin pillar of a war on terror and a war on culture, or culture wars and terror wars. And so these kinds of deep political events have forensics that you can go look at. And that obviously was what was almost totally absent from Tucker's questioning of Putin about the launching of the invasion of Ukraine. It became clear to me that Tucker didn't even, at one point, he had no clue what year Putin was talking about in terms of Ukrainian politics. As we've early on in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we harped on that there's this whole narrative warfare arc that want to begin the history of Russia-Ukrainian political battles in 2014. Instead, just go back another decade and you can really see a little bit fuller dimensions. And Putin was actually talking about that era, and Tucker had no facts, no forensics. He was just spinning. He had no clue what year Putin was talking about. And of course, like, this is 2004. I think that's the year when Yushchenko, the opponent of Yanukovych, was poisoned by some kind of very likely inside job in high up in terms of very likely Russian moles.
Probably Berezovsky's people, Jeremy. Come on. To frame Russia.
To frame Russia, yeah, exactly. And remember, Agent Orange, Yushchenko reemerges with a totally pocked face. And remember, it was called the Orange Revolution. And I pointed out, too, that there's an aspect of, the Russians are heavy literary folks, so their intelligence services play with these literary irony. They do a lot of irony, bro, kind of deep events, I think. So they were playing with this Agent Orange derivative to frame up this idea of this American color revolution, of the Orange Revolution, but also Agent Orange, a lot of like whataboutism kind of in there, or exposing American war criminality in Vietnam at the same time. Those are the kind of undercurrents that I get from that.
Wow. Yeah. And you brought up the remember, even going back to the pre-2014, going back to 2004 at least, and then even in the lead up to that, somebody who I want to talk about here for a minute, Ben Shapiro, who is seen by some as like the face of the anti-Trump, whatever, like the posiers who are trying to infiltrate what's considered alt media and term and pushing like an anti-Trump, pro-Israel narrative and all of this, and where Ben Shapiro himself, even prior to 2014, was getting information and funneling it through Breitbart.com about the, I think, mutual people who I think both the mutual people who both, I think, a mutual vested interest in terms of the both elements of Russian and Israeli active measures and propaganda circles in terms of pushing the opposition to basically, I think it was the opposition to Yanukovych in Ukraine and the as the neo-Nazis around Timoshenko in particular, and how this makes the Clinton State Department, complicit in even rumblings of neo-Nazism in Ukraine, anti-Semitism in Ukraine, even before Maidan in 2014, much less the most recent last few years of real hardcore narrative pushing of the Nazification of Ukraine. So, I mean, it goes back before that, and that's another example of going back prior to where people want to say that this all started in 2014 when the West came in and forced this elected official who simply wanted to have better relations with Russia out, and then forced Putin's hand into annexing Crimea in 2014. So let's throw that in there as well. And also on the matter, reason I brought up Ben Shapiro is because,
Greg, will you just hold that thought and then you can finish up with Shapiro? But I just want to point out that the way that a lot of this is working on the left narrative warfare spheres in terms of even 2014, the era that they want to go back to, is that like Aaron Mate, I saw totally, I think dishonestly portraying the actual history of the post-Maidan theater of operations in eastern Ukraine, which is something that we will return to again fairly soon in the future, in terms of that this was a dirty war that was prepped, that had been already politically there was a political warfare dynamic that had been put into place for at least 10 years, but then even just pure Russian military intelligence cutouts on the ground in terms of Gherkin was ready to go. You remember this whole thing about the little green men and Russia denying that this was just a total organic movement, both in Crimea and in the Donbass and eastern Ukraine. And meanwhile, no, they were ready to go, and there is direct testimonial evidence from the Gherkin types even that they were very much. Gherkin actually claims to be the guy who started the Ukraine war. And so all these, the way that it's playing on the apologist left is by trying to leave out what the kinds of components that if this were in Central America and this were like the United States and the Iran-Contra, or the installation of a military dictatorship in Guatemala or something like that, or then the funding of certain insurgent, quote unquote, terrorist dynamics around things like the Contras, that this would be immediately then brought into the history. But there is no sense of any kind of actual Russian deep politics, and it needs to be integrated here. And that's what we want to do, is have a very full spectrum in multinational assessment of deep politics that not only deals with our first and foremost focus, which obviously being Americans, this idea that we have a first and foremost responsibility in relationship to our own country and our own government and the criminality and corruption that exists there. But it doesn't mean that we then have to totally rewrite history that favors other, quote unquote, deep states around the world.
Indeed. And going back to Ben Shapiro, and thank you for bringing that in, Jeremy. You're absolutely right. I noticed his reaction, Shapiro's, to the Tucker interview, because I guess much like post October 7th, where they were sniping at each other about, what's more important, Israel's security or our own border security. And it's interesting now because they've both, we've come full circle to where they're now both pushing the border crisis narrative really hard in terms of both Shapiro and Carlson. But there was a moment in Shapiro's response to Tucker Carlson's trip to Moscow. He defended the Putin interview, but was critical of his actual like propaganda trip to Moscow. And I feel like I feel like I shouldn't, but I do need to put in like almost like a reminder that like when it comes to things like Carlson v. Shapiro or Shapiro v. Owens, Candace Owens, and now Candace Owens seems happily back in the Daily Wire fold like nothing ever happened. But when it comes to these types of dynamics and these types of like feuds or however real or fake they are or whatever, is that it's okay to be of the mindset that both these people suck is my mentality on it for a lot of reasons. And so I think that that's something that should be understood by more people than I think it is in some ways. But I digress. But Shapiro's response was, with regards to Tucker, was to basically call it like you're being an apologist for Russia and all this. And but the response was instructive in that in the particular moment where he critiqued Tucker at the Moscow subway station, that he compared him to Bernie Sanders. And I guess Bernie Sanders also at this same subway station did a video back in his trip he made to Moscow in the late 80s. It was and so I guess there is a bit of like a continuity there, but at the same time, like for me, like I'm thinking, if Ben Shapiro is what these MAGA diehards make him out to be, like this ultimate never Trumper who wants to destroy MAGA conservatism by infusing it with Israel and hardline Zionism and all this and whatever terms you want to use for that, then I can think of more relevant figures that could be used as an example of the of very Moscow Russian friendly propaganda, but instead he uses Bernie Sanders, which reiterates into the minds of his audience that, Tucker's acting like one of these radical leftist borderline commies. This is how they are the ones who love Russia. And so what, just putting this back in the mindset of it's all of comparing Tucker to Bernie Sanders instead of comparing Tucker to, I don't know, the guy who a lot of the MAGA base is convinced is trying to destroy Trump himself. Maybe that guy, maybe Ben Shapiro could have compared Tucker Carlson to Donald Trump, but he doesn't want to do that. And I think big reason for that is because Shapiro is acting. I think this was an instructive moment where and I think it's been the case for a while, but he's acting in a similar way to where a lot of these members of Congress who did not take the Trump investigations to where they should have gone.
Also, it was the perfect moment for any real, authentic, honest intellectual to have done a little bit of a mea culpa. He could have even still brought in Bernie Sanders and been like, wasn't it interesting that the Trump campaign and parts of the Bernie Sanders campaign had these Paul Manafort elements, the Tad Devines in the case of Bernie Sanders, the network of which Paul Manafort actually used me to deploy Russian propaganda that was generated from the Ukrainian sphere, and then looks like it was pushed through the very Russian-friendly Likud. He's not in Likud, but the right-wing Israeli bouncer Avigdor Lieberman. When he was at the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and then funneled directly to me when he was still at Breitbart. And so it was Tucker Carlson's Ben Shapiro moment, really.
Indeed. And that would be a great question for Ben Shapiro if someone were ever able to ask it of him, because I believe, and I think you do too, that there's a reason why Shapiro won't go to that conclusion. I think it's kind of I think it's relatively clear as to why, but that would be a great question for him, and why instead he just puts it into like this garden variety narrative of, Tucker's acting like a leftist, or like the commies did, and loving Russia, or like the Bolshevik Bernie. Oh, look, he loves Russia and all of this, blah blah blah. While meanwhile they continue to push the same narrative warfare talking points in a very symmetrical fashion as all of this is going on. But I think Shapiro is serving a similar role in some ways as to like the way we identify as like the Adam Schiff types is acting in during the first Trump administration in terms of limiting scopes of certain inquiries, is that ultimately this whole idea, and there's truth to it, of course, of like, Ben Shapiro being a representative or a PR mouthpiece for Netanyahu and the Netanyahu interests. So which is what Breitbart was created as, made in America, conceived in Israel, of course, and then going even beyond the whole falling out with Breitbart and basically this satellite of the Breitbart network at Daily Wire. And there's some differences, but it's still part of the same bigger overall long-term network of media operations, is that in this role, ultimately, it ultimately causes whether it's intentional or not, whether it's designed or not, I think it is. I think Shapiro probably knows the score to a large extent. It ultimately covers for the Russian side of things, and like when you are pushing like this, and it goes back to this, that there are these things that tie and bind the Russian and obviously from a multinational perspective, that tie these respective interests together in a very big way, so that ultimately, a Ben Shapiro on the surface is calling Putin a thug and a dictator and a mass murderer, is still serving that role of being of protecting and covering for like the depths of like how the operations go with both of these respective countries, both the respective country that Tucker Carlson is pretty much acting as a fanboy / propagandist for, and the respective country that Ben Shapiro is acting as a fanboy / propagandist for. And, it's high time that more people who should know better start to see these realities for what they are, I think.
Definitely. One just real brief example of the nature of the deep economic and political connection in terms of Russia and Israel and deep politics that looks like it's actually right on the table right now in a covert fashion is all of these push within the Biden administration around diamond money. And it is a really crucial piece of the Israeli economy, actually, is its diamond industry. And I think it's in Ramat Gan. I think it's right around Tel Aviv. And it is a major part of the Israeli economy, is the handling of diamonds, the prepping them for international sale, and the Russian-Israeli mafia connection in terms of diamonds is so major. And it has now been put on the table by the Biden administration. And so I begin to see some of the nature of the sort of the very cartoonish escalation of legitimate, attacks and political criticism, obviously, of Biden, his physical, psychological state, his basically, Genocide Joe collaboration with Netanyahu in terms of the ongoing, mass slaughter of the Palestinians in Gaza. But meanwhile, it looks like there is an escalation of these cartoonish assaults that I believe are related to pushback in terms of some of these really basic but deep, critical economic and political aspects that bind the deep Russian and deep Israeli state together. Things like the trafficking of diamonds globally and the use of diamonds to wash mob money. Remember all of the deep Israeli involvement in Africa. Lev Levayev, right, and these are Russian Israeli Jewish oligarchs who are very much playing both in the Israeli deep sphere and the Russian deep sphere.
Indeed. And one last bullet point I want to get to before we begin to wrap up, and you talk a little bit about the Palestinian situation before we wrap up, is I wanted to bring in this border security quote unquote debate with the bill, the aid package that was supposed to cover border security, Israel and Ukraine, and I believe Taiwan as well. And so what I had noticed from this, I think, was another going back to like the instructive moment of like where we've gone from 2016 and the first time, like the first Trump takeover of the the GOP and of the American right. And now the second, I think, even much more gradual, increased level of power and influence is the names of a few of the people who joined someone like Rand Paul in opposing this bill. And those particular names are Lindsey Graham, Tom Cotton, and Marco Rubio. Those three names in particular. There's other names as well, but these three are seen particularly. I think obviously Lindsey Graham is seen as like the neocon's neocon. He never met a war or a foreign invasion or a foreign aid package for some bad actor in the world that he didn't like, or on behalf of like a bad actor to punish an American enemy of America that he didn't like. And then Tom Cotton, who wrote a letter to the Ayatollah back in 2014 or 15 on behalf of Bill Kristol's Emergency Committee for Israel back in happier times for the paleo neocons and the non-paleo neocons pre-Trump, pre-MAGA. And then Marco Rubio, who was seen as like he's like the establishment Republican kind of with the foothold in the Tea Party, but he's very much seen as like he's going to be a person who's not going to go along with like a radical with this dramatic shifting of where we were in 2015, 2016 GOP politics to where we are now. But Marco Rubio goes on CNN with Jake Tapper last Sunday morning and is asked directly about Donald Trump, basically saying that, if they don't pay Russia now, you compared it to Russia, if you're listening, get her emails moment. Like, Russia, if you're listening, if these countries don't pay us, go in and do whatever you want with them. That was I think you'd made that comparison, Jeremy. And Marco Rubio's response is, well, he's not serious about this, and you guys are focused way too much on this. And Donald Trump's not a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He doesn't talk like conventional politicians do. And you media people are too concerned with your witch hunt against him. And don't take him seriously, which interestingly enough, Ben Shapiro, when he talked about Trump's comments about NATO, basically said the same thing. So, try that one on for size. But it's very instructive. I think another moment of like how instructive we are in that these types of traditional, like they were kind of the traditional representatives of the hawkish terror war neocon wing of the GOP, as we knew it in a previous life, have now evolved or devolved in some ways to where now they're joining the likes of Rand Paul and the quote-unquote anti-war Republicans and opposing this foreign aid package in the name of we have to protect the border. And then this way that this whole, once again, like that's a whole nother conversation, Jeremy, the long-term issues that have led to like things that are taking place on the border now, all the way from destabilization of Latin American countries and economies to even domestic dynamics as far as American economics and American terms of things that have happened as far as to like certain elements of the job base and manufacturing base here domestically that lead to problems like this. But instead it becomes like just this basic, Biden and the woke Biden administration and the woke DEI pushers who want to chop off your children's genitals are going to flood your country with invaders who want to kill you and your grandparents for being white conservative Christian Americans and all of this. And so it's but it's to a point now where, and I noticed this morning as well, Lindsey Graham on Face the Nation on CBS, once upon a time known as Grahamnesty. He was the political child of John McCain, who was the neocon who loved war and loved amnesty and all this. At least that was the way it was portrayed and put there. And Lindsey Graham is openly saying that he's still trying to have his cake and eat it in terms of like, well, we have a better plan in place that will actually hold Putin accountable and protect Zelensky, but we have to take care of our border first. And so it's pretty, it's incredible. It's a very I don't know if too much really surprises me. I don't even know if this really surprises me, so to speak, as much as it is like instructive. But I think it's very instructive that we've now in this position where now you've got these figures in the Congress, right, in the heart of things, who all three, I think, or at least in the case of both Rubio and Graham, had both gone, and Paul, who they're now joined together with it, all three publicly condemned Donald Trump in a very, very vocal fashion, with Lindsey Graham going as far as to say our party is done if this man is nominated and becomes president, to where now they're all openly and still doing so. I think this is important to point out too, Jeremy. They're still doing so in a manner that still aids this bigger hybrid of the culture war and the terror war. Basically, the culture, the people who are destroying our culture are bringing the terror wars to us by flooding our border with all these invaders, and among them are going to be terrorists who are going to kill Americans in mass numbers if we're not careful. And that takes precedence over like even traditional areas of like where there was always an agreement about like we have to protect these treaties, and we have to protect these countries that are allied with America, and we have to and we're also going to be the people that are going to, for better or for worse, we're going to we're going to fund and help people who are victims of aggression or whatnot. Of course, there's a whole long, nuanced history about that we don't need to rehash here. But we've moved to where now, like the Grahams and the Cottons and the Rubios are joining hands with the Rand Paul wing now, and they're doing it in a manner where it still aids both the culture war and the long-term terror war that all of these guys have been major protagonists for.
Yes, and I would point out that a lot of what you're describing, I think, can be directly seen as the flack of the escalation of political and informational warfare that is part of specifically three international figures who are engaged in different aspects of culture war and terror war for their own political lifeblood, basically. You have Netanyahu. It's become obvious to almost everyone now that Netanyahu is managing his Gaza genocide operation and extending it and massaging it and making sure that no more hostage trades happen, so there can be a pressure to actually bring a conclusion to the attack, the kinetic attack on the Palestinians. And it's obvious to everybody that Netanyahu has not only these long-term interests of the so-called security state of Israel, but just his own political survival to keep this thing going. And it's very much predicated on, I think, the terror war is the prime mover of the information warfare surrounding Netanyahu's operation in Gaza. But there is very much a culture war layer dynamic, especially in the way that it's playing in informational spheres in the United States, as we talked about before, in terms of the accusations of Hamas lovers, the direct apparent IDF chemical warfare assault on Palestinian solidarity protesters on the Columbia campus, the ousting of certain Ivy League leadership in relationship to them allegedly asserting that it's okay, it's protected speech to call for the genocide of Jews, or these kinds of things. I think are indicative that there is a culture war underbelly to Netanyahu's, I would say, apex terror war assault on Gaza. You also have Trump, who it looks to me like he's engaged in a culture war for his own self-preservation, and that he sees politics and his ability to try to get back into power as the way that he can ultimately save himself. And not save the country, just save himself. And I think that is very likely true. And a lot of that's culture war dynamics.
And just on that point real quick, we've regressed or devolved to the point to where now the people who at one point were seen as the ones who would at least be some sort of quote unquote resistance or attempt to stand back or push back against the Trump figure. The aforementioned Congress and aforementioned senators and other people it's to the point where things have just become so where the whole MAGA weaponized takeover has just become so pronounced that they're now openly aiding like this increasingly cognitively declining, increasingly unstable mentally and otherwise figure who attempts to hold on to power. Like they're directly complicit in it now.
Yeah, and then a lot of these roads then also then go head toward Putin too, in terms of there is a very strong global culture war dynamic to his invasion of Ukraine, and meanwhile a lot of it is then couched in the terms of the terror war. And by the way, like I think I underplayed the terror war component of the long-term Trump strategy, especially as this is where some of the most disinformation exists, because his supporters throughout, especially throughout the right, everywhere from like the MAGA right to the Mises Caucus, the libertarian right, this idea that the one good thing that Trump did was that he didn't start a new war. And they almost never, I think virtually never, point out that Trump actually escalated the terror war in terms of drone strikes in Africa. It was very much escalated under Trump. And although you can say that he didn't start a new war, he definitely escalated the big war, the long war, in a post 9/11 fashion. So not only did did we not find out who knocked down the towers on 9/11, he deployed the false mythos of the 9/11 attacks to escalate the war, the terror war, especially into Africa. All right, so there's that, and then Putin is definitely, it's a little bit more complex, I think, in terms of the Putin motive around the nature of the war in Ukraine. Whether it seems like there's certain aspects where he has an imperative to begin to draw it to a close that will be satisfying to his political base in Russia. And yet there's also a sense of like that there is a extension of the culture war dynamics that play very well for their more global architecture, in terms of now now it's been documented, a big push, an escalation of Russian information, political warfare operatives and dynamics, especially in Europe and the United States. Apparently, in anticipation of especially like this coming election in the United States. So there's a question there in terms of like what does Putin really want to extend this war on Ukraine? Does he want it to bring it to some resolution that meets some of his geostrategic interests, or what's going on there? Because it's definitely the case that Russia has really created a hyper-militarized economy now in order to take on this war on Ukraine. So I think we should watch all of these spheres. It's very dangerous because we have these three, big political heavyweights who are all vying for their political, in some cases, national kind of lives in relationship to these different kinds of endless wars.
Indeed, and I think for some of us who are a bit, are pretty astute in these circles of like trying to understand like all three of these people and their potential motivations, both ones we understand and ones we might not understand as much. That there was a really good thread on X, formerly known as Twitter, that you sent from, I believe the account is called Renetification, and it took from, I think it was a CIA pamphlet, and laid out ways based on this ways of both the direct warfare in terms of like direct events of January 6th on the ground, as well as propaganda and propaganda warfare methods in the lead up to January 6th. I think is pretty instructive. I think from and a big part of this, it would be instructive in terms of like a culture war type of groundwork layout for greasing the skids for. So I think it's instructive in helping to bit of an understanding of like a combination of on the ground aspects and then a greasing of the skids in terms of propaganda and otherwise, using the power of the internet and social media and deploying it in a way like we hadn't seen like this type of like information warfare deployed before, at least domestically here. And so we'll link to that. I think I think there's some instructive takes that could be gotten from that thread.
Yes, and as similarly the way that my shorthand for what I believe is the case in terms of the deep dynamics behind the October 7th attacks is this a cell of Israeli special forces. One of them being the prime minister Netanyahu, one of them being the former prime minister Ehud Barak, with the real deep tie to the Epstein network. Another one being what's his name, Naftali Bennett, and along with Ehud Barak working the media angles post October 7th. And then the Herzl, the head of the, basically the chief of staff, I think the general chief of staff for the Israeli military, all special forces veterans, Sayeret Matkal, one of two Israeli non-patched, very covert operations and black operations behind enemy lines style special forces. And so more and more with what you're talking about the resonance of the CIA handbook for dirty wars in Central America, really, especially it escalated during the 80s, that I think we begin to really see something similar in terms of the 11/9 operation from 2016, but now escalated in terms of 2024, where I think we see a special forces cell that are a grouping around these kinds of information warfare, but also where it goes kinetic in terms of January 6th. I think you got to see someone like a Michael Flynn, who's definitely, special forces, an Ivan Reichlen, right? Then in the background, working certain kind of alt media angles, you have a Boykin, General Boykin, right? Operation going
And
on.
Jerry Boykin ties into the Dominionists and I think the New Apostolic Reformation, which had a heavy hand on the ground on J6 as well.
Right, and then sort of somewhere in the background there, with a question about where he plays into all of this, especially in terms of the relationship with Michael Flynn, is Stanley McChrystal. So I think a similar. I think that would be seen as a similar kind of special forces cell in the United States that we can see working dirty war angles that are predominate from this information warfare kind of environment, but that then have a tendency to quote unquote go live and go kinetic when you see something like a January 6th, and who knows what else they have planned. Because the other thing is you hear Trump promising a new terror attack. We pointed out that his rise to power in terms of 2015, 2016 was littered with all these very shady terrorist attacks, not only in the United States, but also in the European theater. And so this is a very dangerous moment when you combine all of this.
Indeed. And right. And my final point on this will be that the one, and I'm just reiterate this because you made me think about it with, you mentioned the whole Boykin thing and people like Rick Joyner and his group, the Oak Initiative that are mentioned in this X thread of these are this is major, big time, high level like hybrid of the terror and culture wars through both very religious and more secular based terror war hawks, maybe in the case of like the Flynn network, and then like the Boykin network and some of these people that maybe they're involved with that respectively of these were the terror war hardliners who were pushing the language of pushing the possibility of like some type of military-based coup against the Obama administration, and then also that coinciding with the rise of the U.S. deep state created ISIS, and Trump is going to team up with Putin, basically, whether they said it or not. Basically, Trump and Putin were going to team up to wipe out the terrorists that the Western deep state continues to create. So I just thought of that based on what you brought up there, Jeremy. And before we finally do wrap up, you want to take a little bit to talk about preview this where we're going to be going with this with Palestine and some of these figures, influential figures in terms of the Palestinian quote, leadership. And you might say whether legitimate leadership or not is another story. But you want to talk a little bit about that before we finish?
Sure, and I promise I won't go Putin on these couple of minutes here. We'll do that in a future episode. Okay, but I just want to say that there is murmurings now, especially with where the question of Rafah comes into focus, where the Israeli military and Netanyahu specifically drove the Palestinian civilians southward, and basically saying this is your safe zone all along the way, attacking people who were escaping often, and just continue to see the mass horror. Basically, it's the small days in this ongoing assault on the Palestinians has been like 100 deaths, but it's gone above 1,000 on certain days, and it's obviously probably well more than half of the dead are women and youth, and you can go look at the scrolling names of just the newborns that the Israelis have killed in their attempted national genocide of the Palestinian people there. And so it's obvious to me that, like, if Israel were were serious and honest in terms of what it says it's about, in terms of security or democracy or rule of law, the main long-term question was the right of return. All of this stems from the question of right of return for the Palestinians. Even UNRWA, right? Israel just bombed the UNRWA building. And that all stems from the question of Palestinians driven under war and under terrorism from their traditional homelands and from their homes, their literal homes where they still have the keys. The question of that resolution, like in a legitimate, post World War II modern state, would have dealt with that question, and they would have post October 7th, actually set up quote unquote refugee camps in southern Israel. They could do screening in terms of determining who is Hamas and who is not Hamas, right? But instead, it's exactly as we suspected. There's the driving into the Sinai for the lucky Palestinians looks to be an attempt on the table in terms of the ethnic cleansing operation. So it is not only Nakba 2.0, as people have pointed out, but it's escalated. It's much more genocidal even than the original ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And so in the middle of all of this, then the murmurs are, well, okay, you have, as we pointed out last time, there is some amount of public push for an actual quote unquote two-state resolution to this issue. So this doesn't keep happening and all of that. And Netanyahu rejects this out of hand. Most of the Israeli public officials reject all of this out of hand. But meanwhile, there is international conversation going on in terms of, all right, well, then what happens post-Israeli, destruction of Gaza? Who is going to be in charge in terms of the Palestinian side of things? And so everyone knows I believe that the only resolution to this would have been and would still be a one-state rule of law, equal rights for all, including right of return. And sure, is that a negation of the Jewish state? Yes, it's not continues to not be a legitimate. I think it continues to be not a legitimate practice. So finishing up, I'm heading into Putin land here in terms of where I'm going with this. I just want to end this up by pointing out that there are certain actual dissidents that exist. Right. Remember, the main split is you have the PLO, Fatah in terms of the more secularist and more West Bank-oriented parts of Palestinian leadership and political resistance. And then you have the Hamas, more religious and Gaza-oriented. And there are dissidents in both camps. And one example is someone named Omar Barghouti, who has been involved in, kinetic resistance in relationship to Israeli occupation. He desired diplomacy and then saw that it was not heading in that direction. And so he's imprisoned. It looks like he would actually be very likely the most popular Palestinian leader if there were a vote to take place where he would beat out both Hamas leadership and Mahmoud Abbas's Fatah leadership, the so-called PA. But there's this character that continues to be pushed forward named Mohammed Dalan, which we'll get more into the deeper background there because he actually comes out of Fatah. He was actually the security director in Gaza early on, especially around the time of the transition to Hamas. And he is also a crucial character on the ground in terms of the 11/9 operation. He appears that he's been in exile of some sort in the United Arab Emirates, I think in Abu Dhabi, for many, many years. And he's also been on the ground in Russia a lot. He was a prisoner. It looks like for many years, a lot of Palestinians have suspected of him actually being some kind of Israeli-controlled agent. And he then was brought into Russia as almost looked like he's being proposed as an alternative to Mahmoud Abbas in terms of Russian diplomacy. So this is someone to keep our eye on. I believe that this is the 11/9 operators, the 11/9 perpetrators would like to see Mohammed Dalan installed on top of this whole West Bank to Gaza political Palestinian leadership question. And he looks to us to have been at the epicenter of the actual 11/9 operation, serving as a very likely connector from Mohammed bin Zayed in the United Arab Emirates, very likely, I think, to aspects of the Israeli government in a much more covert fashion, but very then much into Putin's Russia.
All right. Thank you for that. And we'll be getting more into this. And I think with that, we will wrap it up here for today.
All right. That sounds good.
All right. Thank you, Jeremy.
All right. Thank you, Greg. And thank you, everybody. We appreciate you. Until next time, AnteDote, we are out.